Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. 2020 has been dominated by news of the pandemic and social unrest that has swept our country over the last several months. You probably have forgotten, if you ever knew it at all, that 2020 marks the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which extended to women the right to vote 100 years ago. A long and difficult struggle that began almost a century earlier in the beginning of the 19th century, and for a lot of people continued well past 1920, as we will see. Famously, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John when he was serving in the Continental Congress in 1776 and said, as you're creating a new national government, she famously said, quote, remember the ladies. That did not happen. In 1792, the British writer Mary Wollstonecraft published a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, in which she called for complete educational equality and political equality between men and women, a clarion call for revolution that was not heeded for many years. Women entered the political fray in large numbers in the United States in the 19th century through reform movements that swept the country, primarily temperance and especially abolition, the move to abolish slavery in the United States and prevent its extension into the territories. There were many. The abolition movement was dominated, of course, by Northeasterners, primarily middle and upper class white men and women. But there were large numbers of African American women who participated as well, who also got involved later on in the women's rights movement, including, of course, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Fortin Purvis, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and many others, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Now, some women were excluded from an abolitionist conference in 1840, and they began to push for a more widespread women's movement. The first national call for that was in 1848, in July that summer, over 2 days in Seneca Falls, New York, at a convention organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. A conference of women got together, a clarion call for women's rights, and particularly women's suffrage, the right to vote extended to women. Now, as you can imagine, this met with widespread ridicule, and it was something that women had to push back against for the next 72 years. A lot of men, and women too, said that women's place was in the home, nurturing family and nurturing the home. These two institutions vital to the Republic. If women entered this sordid and corrupt world of American politics, the Republic would suffer greatly, if not collapse completely. And this was a battle that women's suffrage had to fight against for the next 7+ decades. Even Queen Victoria in Great Britain notoriously opposed the women's rights movement throughout her life. Now, abolition, of course, by 1865, with emancipation, it seemed that the job had been done. The women's rights movement went on, but became fractured by race. In 1869, as Americans debated granting black men the right to vote, which eventually happened in the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1869, for many white women involved, who had been involved in the abolitionist movement, who were involved in the women's suffrage movement, it was a bridge too far. They said, in their own words, to give what they saw as uneducated black men the right to vote before educated and affluent white women was simply an abomination. And from that moment, the suffrage movement began to fracture along racial lines. Now, in 1869, there were two national organizations that were founded. The National Woman's Suffrage Association, which was dominated by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was founded to advocate for a national amendment. The American Woman's Suffrage Association was more focused on state-by-state constitutional, amending the state constitutions of the various states. These two forces would coalesce and merge together in 1890 and push their resources toward the final ratification of the 19th Amendment 30 years later. Now, as I mentioned, black women were increasingly excluded from national organizations. This was a result of racism, and also, of course, is that white women began to realize increasingly in the Jim Crow era that advocating for black women's suffrage was losing allies all over the country, but particularly in the conservative American South. In 1896, black women founded the National Association of Colored Women, which advocated not only for women's suffrage, but also, of course, social and political equality for black men and women, increasingly in an era of lynching and Jim Crow. In 1890, Wyoming entered the Union as the first state to grant full suffrage to women in national and state and local elections. By 1918, there were 15 other, primarily Western states, that did the same thing. The turn of the 20th century, and particularly into the second decade of the 20th century, saw women engaged in the suffrage movement in large numbers across the country. There were many prominent marches in large cities on the East and West Coast, a march on Washington around the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. World War I did a lot to sweep away widespread opposition to women's suffrage. Women played such an integral role in the victory, both in this country and in Europe. By 1918, both political parties in the United States endorsed women's suffrage. When the amendment came before the U.S. House and Senate in 1919, it passed with the necessary majorities and went to the states for ratification. Still some question as to how it was going to perform in the conservative American South, where white men would have to pass the amendment. The 36th state, the one needed for adoption, was Tennessee on August 18, 1920, by one vote. 8 days later, on August 26, 1920, the Secretary of State announced that the 19th Amendment was now officially part of the U.S. Constitution, and women had won the long struggle to vote. But for many women, that struggle did not end in 1920. Right here in Georgia, for instance, because of restrictive voter registration laws, women couldn't vote in a national election until 1922. Didn't vote in the 1920 presidential election. For black women, of course, that struggle went on for many more decades. Restrictive Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, and other chicanery kept black men and women from voting for many decades, until the civil rights movement, the violence that ensued there, the necessary reforms, and finally the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Many of those southern states that had not adopted the 19th Amendment, by the way, didn't vote for it. Georgia didn't pass it until 1970, just 50 years ago. Now, as Americans prepare to vote in the fall of 2020, once again, voting issues dominate the news. Who will vote, how they'll vote, how those votes will be counted, all are pressing issues right now dominating the news. There are no clear answers. These are issues that, of course, have dominated the American politics from the beginning, don't appear to have any clear answers, and aren't going away anytime soon, even as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago this month. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.